Have you ever wondered what a wild animal would do if it knew it was about to die? In the remote Alaskan wilderness, beneath the weight of a storm so fierce it could freeze breath midair, something beyond comprehension occurred. Temperatures plunged below 45-degree lag. Wind howled like an ancient cry through pine skeletons. Snow swallowed everything, the earth, the sky, the sound of life itself. And yet in the middle of this merciless storm, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, faint, blurred by the whiteout. But then it grew clearer, closer, a massive figure trudging through the snowdrifts. Not a man, not a machine, a bear, a full-grown grizzly, nearly collapsing under its own weight. But this wasn't a predator hunting. This bear wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even looking for food. It was searching. He limped heavily, one paw dragging behind, blood melting trails into the snow. His fur clung to his ribs, soaked and frozen in places. His eyes were hollow, not with rage or fear but with purpose. And between his teeth, gently and strangely cradled, was a bundle wrapped in what looked like torn cloth or moss. And then, as if pulled by something invisible, the bear turned toward a structure no living thing had entered in years. A church, old wooden, weathered by decades of abandonment. Built by Inuit hands generations ago, it once served as a sacred space for prayer before long journeys into the tundra. Now it was broken, forgotten, silent, until this moment. The bear pressed his weight against the door, and it gave way with a groan that echoed like a ghost waking up. Snow blew in. The pews were still there, covered in dust and ice. A shattered stained glass window cast faint light across the altar, and the cross, cracked and leaning, stood like a witness. The bear stepped inside. No one could explain why. No wildlife tracker could predict it. No science could prepare us for what happened next. But a camera was rolling, and a man was watching from a distance. His name was Mike Aput, a quiet soul with a camera lens and a broken past. He'd come to the wilderness to escape, but the wild had just come to him. Mike had filmed wolves giving birth, moose locking horns, even an avalanche nearly taking out an entire ridge. But this was different. There was reverence in the bear's movements, almost ritual. He moved toward the altar and stopped. The wind shrieked outside. Inside, the bear bowed. It was as if he had come to say goodbye. And then he lay down. But the story doesn't end here. In fact, what Mike saw next would haunt him and captivate the world forever. Because what that bear carried in his mouth wasn't what anyone expected. Stay with me, because the next few minutes may change the way you see animals and what we call sacred. To understand what truly happened that day inside the church, you need to know the story behind the man who witnessed it, and the church itself. Nestled deep within the outskirts of Nome, Alaska, beyond any power lines or paved roads, there stands an old Inuit-built chapel known locally as Kanaluk's Rest, where the spirits breathe. It was erected in the early 1950s, a wooden structure designed to honor the bond between man, nature, and what the Inuit believed to be the sacred cycle of life and death. But over the decades, storms ravaged it. The nearby village was abandoned, the people moved, the prayers stopped, and yet the church remained. It was a place lost in time, half swallowed by snowbanks, its roof sagging from years of ice, its bell tower silent. To most, it was a relic. But to Mike Aput, it was a landmark of quiet power, a symbol of everything that could not be explained by reason alone. Mike wasn't always a man of solitude. He once lived in Chicago, a rising star in wildlife photography circles, known for capturing the fierce elegance of wolves and the silent pain in the eyes of caged lions. But that life cracked when cancer took his wife, Siku, 2 winters ago. She had always dreamed of visiting Alaska, of seeing the auroras with her own eyes. They never made it, so Mike came alone. He bought a snowmobile, a solar-powered drone, and a camera rig that could withstand 50-degree IC. And he built a small, self-sustaining cabin less than a mile from the church, not because he believed in God, but because he believed in silence. in stillness, in the raw, untamed poetry of nature. But that morning, the morning the bear came, stillness was not what he found. It began like any other blizzard day. Wind battering the cabin walls. Mike sipping coffee made from melted snow, reviewing footage from the night before. But then, a flicker. His motion sensor triggered. He turned to his screen and saw something moving through the storm. Big, slow, injured. Mike grabbed his parka, threw his drone into the sky and followed. From atop the ridge, through the drone's live feed and his binoculars, he saw the bear, and he saw it enter the church. He froze. His mind raced with questions. Why there? What's it carrying? Is it dying? But more than that, he felt something in his chest, that old ache, the one he thought he'd buried under miles of snow and silence. So he hit record. And in that moment, he made a choice to document whatever this was, not for clicks, not for awards, but because something sacred was unfolding, and the world needed to see it. And you're here now, watching this story, because you need to see it too. Because in a world where most people scroll past pain and beauty without even noticing, this moment asks us to pause. If you believe that nature has secrets to share, lessons about love, sacrifice, and the unseen connections between us, then subscribe now. This channel is for stories that remind us of who we are and what still matters. Mike quietly approached the church on foot, the camera steady in his shaking hands. The snow crunched beneath his boots like dry bones. He could hear nothing but the storm behind him and the sound of his own heart in his ears. He reached the entrance. Inside was nothing but stillness. And then he saw the bear. Massive, majestic, even in agony, resting before the broken altar like a wounded guardian. Its breath was shallow. Steam rose from its body. Blood stained the floor beneath it. But what captured Mike's breath wasn't just the sight of the bear itself. It was the bundle beside it. Tucked against its chest was a small, fragile shape. At first, Mike thought it was debris or cloth, something the wind had thrown inside. But then it moved, ever so slightly. A cub, half-conscious, trembling, eyes fluttering in the half-light. The bear had carried its cub through the storm, across miles of deadly ice, to lay him down at an altar that hadn't heard a prayer in over 30 years. Mike gasped. His knees gave out. What kind of creature does this? What kind of father, in the wild, ruled by instinct and survival, would use his final strength, not to flee, not to fight, but to deliver his child to the only sanctuary he could find? Suddenly, the storm outside didn't feel like danger. It felt like ceremony. Mike realized he wasn't just filming survival. He was witnessing something far rarer, a final act of devotion. Mike couldn't breathe. The camera was still rolling, but his thoughts weren't. Every part of his body was frozen, not from the cold, but from the awe. He had seen dying animals before. He had seen desperate mothers. But this was different. The bear didn't just collapse. It didn't just stumble and fall into a random building for shelter. It had chosen this place. It had entered with intent, with grace. And now, with its cub safely placed beside the old altar, it began to move again, slowly, painfully, as though it was following a path it had walked before in another life. Mike dared not make a sound. He crouched behind the doorway, keeping his distance, careful not to spook the animal. But the bear didn't even glance in his direction. Its eyes were fixed forward. The wind outside continued to scream, lashing through the broken glass panes and torn wood. But inside, everything was still. Time had lost its meaning. The church was no longer just a church. It had become a temple of survival, of sacrifice. The bear's massive frame heaved with each breath. Blood still trickled from a deep wound along its left shoulder, likely from a fall or fight, perhaps even a snow-covered cliff. And yet it kept going. Paw after paw, step by step, it moved with quiet determination, toward the altar, toward the place where, once upon a time, people knelt to beg for life. As Mike filmed, he caught himself whispering, "What are you doing?" But deep down, he already knew. The bear reached the front of the chapel and paused. It looked up, not at Mike, not at the camera, but at the cross. It was crooked now, leaning slightly to the left, hanging from rusted bolts. Part of it had broken off in a storm years ago, but it still stood, a forgotten symbol in a forgotten place. And in that moment, the bear sat. Yes, sat. Its breath shallow, but eyes alert. The cub beside it shifted, letting out the faintest whimper. The bear responded with a grunt so soft it sounded almost like a lullaby. And then something impossible happened. It lifted its head and raised one paw. For a moment, it simply held the gesture, midair, trembling slightly but steady. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't wild. It was reverent, the way a human might raise their hand during a vow, or a mother might reach out to protect her child, or a soul might reach upward. Mike's eyes filled with tears, and not from the wind. This wasn't instinct, this wasn't biology. This was a ritual. This was a ceremony of farewell. In the pews, ice hung like drapes. Icicles curved down from the ceiling beams, glistening like frozen candles. Dust from years of silence lay untouched, until now. And as the bear lowered its paw and exhaled deeply, a snowflake drifted through the shattered stained glass window and landed gently on its nose. It didn't move again. Mike stayed still, afraid to even blink. A full minute passed, then 2. Finally, he stepped closer. The cub looked at him, weak, barely conscious, but alive. Its fur matted, tiny chest rising and falling. One paw twitched, but the bear, the father, did not move. Mike moved the camera away from his face and looked directly at the creature who had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about wild animals. He wasn't just witnessing an end. He was witnessing a choice. Because somewhere along the way, during that long walk through the snow across frozen streams and jagged ridges, the bear could have stopped, could have chosen a cave, a ditch, a hollowed log. But he didn't. He chose the only place built by man that had once known reverence. He chose an altar. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe. But as Mike stared into the bear's now still eyes, he saw something more. He saw peace. There was no fear in that body, no tension in its muscles, only rest. The kind of rest that comes after fulfilling a final mission. Mike's hand trembled as he turned off the camera. He stepped around the altar, gently, and knelt beside the cub. He could feel the chill radiating off its tiny body. Its eyes fluttered weakly. It wasn't crying. It wasn't panicking. It was simply waiting, just like its father had. Mike took off his outer coat, wrapped the cub gently, cradling it against his chest. The bear didn't stir. Still kneeling, Mike looked up at the cracked ceiling. The wind had shifted. It wasn't howling anymore. Outside, the blizzard had begun to die down, just a little, enough for light to pour through the shattered panes of color in the stained glass, casting red and blue and golden streaks over the fur of both creatures. It looked like a blessing. Mike knew what he had to do. He whispered, "I'll get him out." And as he turned to leave, the cub safely pressed against him, the weight of what he'd just witnessed crashing into his chest. He took one last look over his shoulder. The bear remained, but not in pain, not in fear. He remained as a protector, as a father, as a memory engraved into the frozen walls of a forgotten church, now made sacred again by love. Mike stood in the doorway for a moment longer, heart racing beneath his thermal jacket. Every instinct told him to stay back, to keep observing from a distance. But something deeper, older maybe, urged him forward. It wasn't courage, it wasn't logic, it was reverence. He stepped inside. The wooden floor groaned beneath his boots, brittle and warped from years of frost. Light shimmered through broken glass, dancing across the bear's fur and the small cub, now wrapped in Mike's jacket. It felt surreal, as if he had walked into a dream too sacred to disturb. But there was something else, a feeling, not fear, but dissonance. The air felt thick, heavy, almost like walking underwater. Every breath came with the weight of unspoken history. This wasn't just about the bear, it wasn't just a rescue. It felt like he had stepped into someone else's final prayer. Mike knelt beside the cub again. Its breathing was slower now, almost imperceptible. He gently pressed his fingers against its chest. Still alive. Still fighting. He reached into his pack, fumbling with trembling hands for a thermal blanket and his emergency sat phone, but stopped midway. A sound. Not from the cub. From behind him. Slow. Subtle. Mike turned. The bear hadn't moved. Not an inch. But something in the room had shifted. He couldn't explain it. The temperature hadn't changed, but his skin prickled. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was charged, expectant, as if the walls themselves were listening. He rose slowly, scanning the room. The pews were empty. Shadows flickered. Snow whispered through the cracks in the wall. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something unfinished. He glanced back at the bear. Dead still, eyes open, chest unmoving. And yet, its presence remained. Mike had filmed countless animals. He'd seen bears in aggression, fear, confusion, but never one that lingered like this. Even in death, this bear seemed aware. He stepped forward again, not toward the cub, but toward the altar, toward the place where the bear had raised its paw, where it had bowed, where something unspoken had passed between predator, storm, and sanctuary. He wasn't here just to rescue. He was part of the story now. He reached out toward the altar's edge, a single finger tracing the cracked wood. As he touched it, a gust of wind blew through the door behind him, slamming it shut with a thunderous crack. Mike jumped, and in that instant something clicked in his chest, a jolt of clarity or terror. Was this a goodbye? Or was it something else? A message? A warning? A moment this bear had carried not just for his cub, but for the world to see? Mike's hands shook again, not from cold, but from the sheer emotional weight. The camera, still rolling from a side angle, captured everything. His face, his tears, the slow unraveling of a man who thought he had come to the wilderness to disappear, and instead found a message meant for everyone. If you stood inside this church, face to face with a dying bear and its fragile cub, what would you do? Would you stay silent? Or step into the unknown? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters in this story. Mike turned back to the cub. Time was slipping. The strange stillness was tightening again. The storm hadn't truly ended. It had only paused like a breath before something bigger. He knew he had only minutes to act, maybe less. And yet, he hesitated, because something about this place, this bear, this moment, begged him not to just move, but to understand. And that was the real question haunting him now. Not, what do I do? But what am I meant to learn from this? Mike knelt slowly beside the cub, trying not to let the moment overwhelm him. But it already had. The silence in the church was a pressure chamber. Every breath felt thick with meaning. Every heartbeat echoed against the walls as if the very structure were alive and grieving with him. And right there at the base of the altar lay the truth he hadn't been ready to face. This wasn't just a story about survival. It was a story about love. The cub's body was small, far smaller than Mike had expected. Barely the length of his forearm. Its fur clumped and frozen in patches, soaked from the journey through the storm. Its eyes fluttered open, just once, revealing a glimmer of life. Not fear, not panic. Trust. Mike held back tears. This tiny creature, abandoned by all odds and carried across a frozen wilderness, had no logical reason to believe in anything anymore, least of all a human. And yet, when it looked at him, it wasn't as prey. It wasn't even as a stranger. It was as if it knew that the massive body beside it, now still, now silent, had brought it here for this moment, and that the man kneeling down was meant to carry the rest of the journey. Mike gently slid his arms beneath the cub, careful not to disturb its frail limbs. Its weight was almost nothing, like snow compacted in his hands. He could feel its heartbeat, faint and irregular, like a match struggling to stay lit in a storm. "Hold on," he whispered. But even as he said it, he looked to the father. The bear, still at the altar, still unmoved. But now, from this close, Mike could see the truth in full. This wasn't just death. It was surrender. The wound along the bear's shoulder ran deep, dark, and jagged like a canyon carved by ice. Likely days old. Infection had already begun to spread. Mike knew instantly, no creature, no matter how strong, would have made it much farther. And yet he had. Miles. Maybe more. In conditions that would kill even the hardiest animals. All to bring his cub here. And the way he had done it, laying the cub before the altar, bowing beside it, there was no panic in it, no collapse, no chaos. It was deliberate, a final act, a final message. This was not just a bear following instinct. This was a father writing a story in silence, or one that no one else would ever witness unless they happened to be exactly where Mike was now. Exactly where you, the viewer, are sitting right now. The church creaked as if groaning under the weight of grief. Wind whistled through the cracks in the stained glass, bending light into fractured rainbows across the pews. The whole place felt transformed, not just a shelter, but a sanctuary. Not just wood and ice, but something sacred. Mike removed his gloves and reached out toward the father bear. His hand trembled as he touched the coarse, frozen fur. Still warm, but the life inside had passed. He closed his eyes not to pray. He hadn't believed in prayer for years, but to honor. Honor what had just been done. Honor a creature who had loved with such intensity. It had overcome pain, hunger, frostbite, even death. It was then he noticed something else. Just beneath the bear's paw, pressed tight against the altar, was a scrap of material. At first, Mike thought it was moss or part of the cub's bedding, but when he leaned closer, he saw what it truly was. It was fabric, not natural. Woven, old, frayed wool. Red and white, the same colors once used in Inuit ceremonial cloths. Covered in blood, yes, but still recognizably human-made. And the realization hit him like a wave. Had the bear found it along the way? Or had it remembered this place? Had it once watched humans come here dressed in color, lighting candles in the snow? Had it known this was where compassion lived? The weight of the moment crushed him. Because this wasn't just a rescue, it was a ritual. The final steps in a story that didn't need words, because it had symbols, motions, silence that spoke louder than any scream. Mike tucked the fabric into his pocket, not as a trophy, but as a vow. He looked at the cub once more, now warmer inside the coat, now nestled against his chest. It was still fighting, still holding on, and something in Mike shifted. The man who had come here to disappear now felt seen, needed, called. He stood, cub in arms, and took one last look at the father. "I'll take him from here," he whispered. The bear did not reply, but as Mike turned to the door, the wind picked up again. This time not howling, but singing. A soft, melodic rise of air that passed through the beams and rafters like a hymn carried by the wild. He stepped out into the cold. The storm had softened, light beginning to stretch across the snowfields in long golden rays. The snow beneath his boots felt less cruel now, like something that remembered softness. Behind him, the church stood still, guardian of a memory now sealed in frost and wood. And in his arms, the cub breathed, just once, a tiny, determined inhale. It would survive, not because of luck, but because of a father who chose love over instinct, and found his altar not in safety, but in surrender. Mike's boots crunched through the snow as he stepped out of the church, the cub wrapped tightly against his chest, breathing faint but steady. Every step he took away from the altar felt heavier than the one before, as if each footfall carried not just the weight of the cub, but the responsibility of what had just happened inside. He didn't stop walking until the church was no longer in sight. Then he paused, not from exhaustion but from the ache growing in his chest, the ache of choice. Because now, it was real. This tiny life was in his hands, and there were no guarantees. No veterinarians for miles. No backup. No tranquilizer team. No warm clinic. No stable power. No medical tools. Just a cabin. a few emergency supplies, and whatever instincts he had left after grief and time had hollowed him out. He looked down at the cub. It was no longer shivering, but that wasn't a good sign. It was limp. Its paws dangled like leaves in the wind, its breath shallow, and its eyes barely stayed open. The cub had survived the storm, the journey, and the sacrifice of its father, but it was running out of time. Mike clenched his jaw. He had already done what most people would never dare, entered a church with a wild bear, cradled a wild cub, and walked back into the storm with it in his arms. But now came the part that no camera could capture, the doubt. What if bringing the cub into his cabin caused it more harm than good? What if it needed something he couldn't give? Milk, medicine, warmth his body couldn't provide. What if it died anyway? Was it kinder to let it pass where its father had fallen? He stopped walking. The cold bit through his boots and up his spine. The cub wheezed, not a cry, not a call, but a sound like surrender. Mike squeezed it closer to his chest. "No," he said softly. "Not like this." He adjusted the thermal layers around the cub, pulling one side of his coat tighter to trap heat. The animal's heartbeat was faint, but still there, like a candle in a cave. He took a breath. Then he ran. Through the thinning wind. Across the frozen ridge. Down the slope toward his cabin, his legs burning, lungs frozen. The storm clung to him like ghosts, but he didn't stop. He wouldn't. Inside, he kicked the door open, rushed to the wood stove, and tossed in 3 logs with shaking hands. The fire flared to life. He placed the cub inside a thick nest of towels beneath a heating lamp, flickering with weak but warm light. He dropped to his knees beside it. Now came the longest part. Waiting. He dabbed its paws with warm cloth, avoiding frostburn. He whispered again and again, "Stay with me." He closed the blinds, lit the emergency lanterns, turned off his sat phone to conserve battery. Everything else in the world could wait. There was only this. One small life, one fragile breath, and a memory still echoing in the broken silence of a forgotten church. He sat by the cub all night. Hour after hour, the room filled with the soft hiss of the fire and the quiet ticking of a cracked wall clock. Occasionally, the cub stirred, just a twitch, a sigh, the flick of an ear. Not much, but enough, and Mike never moved. He watched. He remembered. He felt. Not just for the cub, but for himself. Because something else had been rescued in that church. Not just an animal, not just a heartbeat, but a piece of Mike that had died with his wife, a part that had wanted to vanish into this frozen world and never return. But now, wrapped in fur, in silence, in the glow of flickering firelight, that part was breathing again. And all because of a bear, who did the unthinkable. If this moment touched your heart, if this father's sacrifice meant something to you, hit the like button, not just for the cub, but for every unseen act of love that never gets filmed, never gets shared, but still changes everything. Because sometimes one click is a way of saying, "I felt that too." Mike leaned in. The cub's eyes opened just a little, 2 dark specks glinting in the firelight. Not afraid, not lost, just aware. Mike smiled. "Welcome back." The night stretched on. The wind outside howled less. The fire inside glowed brighter. And something in Mike, for the first time in years, no longer felt cold. By morning, the storm had vanished. Outside the cabin, the snow lay still, blanketed like a fresh canvas, undisturbed and glowing beneath the soft light of dawn. The winds that had screamed through the mountains just hours before were gone, as if silenced by something greater than nature itself. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long, slow-moving shadows across the floor. The cub lay in a nest of layered towels, its breathing now more rhythmic, more sure. Tiny puffs of warmth escaped its nose with each exhale, misting briefly in the cold corners of the room. Mike sat nearby, slumped in a wooden chair, eyes red from exhaustion, body numb from stillness. But he wasn't asleep. Not entirely. He was listening, not with his ears, but with the part of him that had been closed for so long it had almost forgotten how to feel. He was listening to the silence, the weight of it, the meaning inside it, and it was in that silence that he understood. He had never said goodbye, not to his wife, not to the life they had dreamed of, not to the version of himself that had vanished the day she did. He had run instead, into the wild, into the white, hoping the world would forget him. But life, as it turned out, had a memory longer than grief. His eyes drifted to the cub, still here, still alive, still proof that something in this world, even if it's fragile, even if it's scared, can survive what seems unsurvivable. And then his mind turned to the bear, the father. He hadn't been back to the church. Not yet. But he could feel its presence pressing gently against him, like the way cold lingers in your bones long after you've come inside. He needed to return, not because he had left something behind, but because something had been left for him. He bundled the cub carefully into a lined crate layered with straw and fleece, secured it inside the warmest corner of the cabin, and left a small camera on surveillance. Then, with his coat zipped, boots strapped, and mind steady, he stepped out into the morning cold and followed the path back through the snow. It didn't take long to find the church. Even half buried, it stood tall, not just a ruin, but a monument. The snow around it was still disturbed from his footprints the night before, and from the bears, deep, wide impressions that told the story of the journey that had ended here. Mike opened the creaking door slowly. Nothing had changed. The bear was still there, resting beneath the cross, paws folded, eyes closed. There was no decay, no disruption, only peace, as if the bear had become part of the building itself, absorbed into its story, its meaning. Mike removed his gloves and stepped forward. The air inside was colder than before, but it didn't feel harsh. It felt still, protective. He knelt beside the bear, and for a moment he didn't think or speak. He simply placed his hand on the bear's back, one last time, and breathed. This was not the kind of goodbye filled with words. It was the kind whispered between souls. It was an unspoken contract. One life had ended to give another a chance. One story had closed so another could be told. And Mike understood now. This wasn't about tragedy. It was about timing, trust. A sacred handoff from wild to human, with no guarantees except the promise to carry it forward. He closed his eyes. I saw you. I understand. I won't forget. He stood, backed away, and gave the altar one final look. Then he left. Outside, the sun had climbed just enough to begin softening the ice. The wind picked up slightly, carrying a crisp breath of pine and frozen earth. And as Mike descended the ridge heading back to the cub, to warmth, to the next unknown, he didn't look back, because he didn't have to. Some goodbyes don't live in words. They live in action. They live in what we choose to carry forward. Back at the cabin, the light filtering through the windows felt different. Not just warmer, but gentler. The kind of light that doesn't just illuminate a space, it reveals it. Mike stepped inside quietly. The cub stirred. It had shifted in its sleep, curled tighter, tiny paws twitching slightly. Its nose nuzzled deep into the fleece-lined bedding Mike had layered beneath the stove. The temperature inside the cabin had risen enough to melt the frost on the walls. A slow drip of water ticked from the rafters like a quiet metronome, marking the passage of a new day. Mike crouched beside the crate. The cub's eyes blinked open. Not wide, not startled, just present, alive. And that, for now, was enough. Mike didn't speak. He didn't reach in to touch it. Instead, he sat back, legs crossed, and watched, as if waiting for permission to belong in the space he had created for them both. The cub sniffed the air, then rested its head back down. It was still weak, still healing, but it was safe. And for the first time in days, maybe its entire life, it didn't have to keep moving. Mike leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow. He didn't know how long he could keep the cub alive without proper support, or whether it would ever return to the wild. But he knew this. They had made it through the night. together. The snow outside sparkled. A raven landed on the roof, tapping once and flying away. The forest, once so menacing, now stood quiet. Like it, too, was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. In the corner of the room, Mike's camera light blinked red, still recording. It had captured everything. The moment the cub had taken its first breath in warmth, the stillness of the firelight, the silence between two survivors, man and animal, not speaking, but understanding. And somewhere, out in the world, people would watch. They would feel. They would remember. Where are you watching this story from? Are you somewhere cold like Alaska? Or thousands of miles away, in a place where snow never falls? Wherever you are, right now, you're part of this moment. Drop your location in the comments and let us know how this story reached your heart. Mike rose from the floor, stoked the fire gently, and turned toward the window. The trees no longer felt distant. The cabin no longer felt like exile. And the wild, brutal, beautiful, sacred, no longer felt like a place to hide from grief, but a place to be transformed by it. Behind him, the cub shifted again. It was dreaming now. Of what, Mike could only guess. But something told him it wasn't dreaming of death. It was dreaming of life. Some stories speak without sound. They don't need words, subtitles, or explanations. They move through silence, through breath, through gesture, through presence. And if we're willing to watch with our hearts instead of just our eyes, they can change us. This bear, a wild, wounded father, crossed a frozen wasteland not to survive, but to surrender. Not to flee death, but to give his cub one final chance at life. He didn't roar. He didn't fight. He walked into an abandoned church, placed his child before the altar, and gave everything he had left. And in doing so, he redefined what we think we know about wild animals. He didn't act from instinct alone. He acted with intention, with emotion, with purpose, and maybe, just maybe, with faith. Faith that someone would find them. Faith that the place he chose still held meaning. Faith that his cub might wake up in a world where someone, even a human, would care enough to keep the story going. Mike didn't just witness that moment. He was chosen to carry it forward. And now, so are we. Because this story, brutal, beautiful, breathtaking, is no longer just about a bear and a cub. It's about us. It's about what we value. It's about whether we choose to look away from pain or lean in with compassion. So many animals die in silence every day, but this one didn't. He left behind a message that reached across the cold, across the storm, and across time itself. And you heard it. Right now, somewhere in the world. Maybe in a city, maybe in a village, maybe curled up on your phone late at night. You were part of this moment. And now, it belongs to you too. The fire had almost burned out. Mike sat quietly by the window, sipping the last of his coffee, watching the first blue streaks of morning stretch across the sky. The cub was asleep again, chest rising and falling, its small body nestled into the warmth of survival. Not long ago, both of them had nearly vanished into the white. But now, there was breath. There was silence, not hollow, but whole. There was something new, a beginning. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind. Nothing dramatic, no thunder, no storm, just life as it is unfolding, patient and true. Mike didn't say much on camera that day. He didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than any narration ever could. A bear who gave his final strength for his cub, a man who stepped into the wild to escape grief, and found something sacred waiting for him there. This wasn't a rescue story. It was a redemption story. A reminder that even in the harshest places, acts of grace can still happen. That in the face of extinction, instinct can evolve into something deeper, love. And this is just one of many stories waiting to be told. In every forgotten forest, every hidden mountain, every stretch of frozen silence, life is speaking, asking to be seen, asking not to be understood fully, but to be honored. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that there's still beauty, still bravery, Still meaning in the wild? Then don't let this be the end. Subscribe to the channel now and watch the next story waiting on your screen, because the wild doesn't just survive, it teaches. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in storms, and sometimes in the quiet footsteps of a bear who walked into a church and left behind a miracle. For the forgotten, the fierce, the fragile, their stories deserve to be told. Subscribe, watch the next story, join the Wild Heart Connection,